So let's talk about my least favorite part of the Property Manifesto, which is the role of government. And like, I seriously hate this. I should have done this earlier in the Property Manifesto segments, but I've just dreaded doing it so much that I've just kept pushing it back. But I'm just gonna get it out of the way. And I think that it's a great opportunity, given how much our property rights are being infringed right now, to talk about what a real government, a proper government, would be doing in a crisis like this. I can do some comparisons to what our government's doing and what a propertarian government would do. So, libertarians, we've all kind of said, or had this adage, libertarians that aren't anarchists, sorry, have had this adage that the role of government is to defend liberty. And that's true. You know, Ron Paul has said that. But I would say more specifically that the role of government is to defend our property rights. Okay? Now, a lot of people come at me like, how can an entity that uses force do that? And I'd like to pose an example. We're going to start real close to home. We're going to start with the smallest possible government. So, let's say you live in a neighborhood, right? There's no big overarching government yet. This is like back in the Old West and shit, where like people did the rush out to Oklahoma to get their 1 acre or whatever, and you ended up with like a bunch of people kind of in one area because you all have, like, one of you is really good at farming, one of you is a blacksmith or whatever. You're all sharing resources and you live in like kind of a small little neighborhood. Maybe there's only 20 houses there, right? But there's some other people nearby who, there might be some bandits around, right? And sometimes they come to your little town and they like burgle homes or whatever. And people don't really like that. And maybe one of the guys in your town is like a really good shot. He's like buff. And he's done a good job defending his house from like these, you know, I don't know, bandits who are coming through, right? We're talking about Old West. I just love the Old West. I'm getting a lever action rifle soon, so the Old West has been on my mind. But okay, so let's say you have that kind of guy there. If the rest of the people in those 20 homes decide, we want to pay this person to defend our homes from potential bandits. What is that person then, right? That guy's a cop. Like, you just created a cop. Even if he doesn't have the force of a court behind him, what you've done is say, this guy can use force against bandits who come into our little neighborhood. And I don't see a problem with a neighborhood of people electing to have an individual have that authority in their neighborhood, right? And so, I'm not an anarchist. Personally, I think that the closer you get to the individual, the better, right? Like, this whole huge federal government that we have is bonkers. Absolutely wacko. The people who are running your life don't know anything about you. The idea that we would have an international government is absolutely absurd. I mean, that is just a recipe for disaster. Those people couldn't protect your property rights even if they wanted to, right? But so in essence, the kind of government I'm in favor of, to the extent that it has to exist, because I do think that ultimately any entity that uses force does have some evil in it, right? But at the same time, if there's like little old ladies in a neighborhood who want to hire a guy to make sure that if someone tries to burgle their house, they're protected, I don't really see a problem with that. Now, the only time that person would be justified in acting and wouldn't be going outside of the scope of what a just government would do, is when they're acting in defense of a property right, that individual would be justified in defending themselves. Okay? So this is part of the problem with what our government does now, all right? It's not like our government just prosecutes people who commit acts of violence or acts of aggression against others. It's not like they're just fighting burglars or murderers or rapists, right? It's like they're putting people in jail for doing drugs, you know? They're putting people in jail for, I don't know, like what's going on right now? People are getting put in jail for taking their kids to play at a playground, you know, for opening a nail salon or a hair salon. And these are not acts of aggression against anyone else's property. And so any time where a government is acting in a way where the property owner in question would not be justified in acting with force, would be an illegitimate act of government. That would mean that the government is now the criminal themselves. Because like Bastiat really talked about in the law, the government really shouldn't be able to do anything that a private citizen couldn't do, you know? And in my opinion, there are times when it's okay for me to use force against some other people, right? If someone breaks into my home in the middle of the night, I think I can use force against that person. I think I can use deadly force against that person. Same thing if some guy, like I'm walking down the street at night in Denver, some guy tries to sexually assault me, I think I am more than justified in using deadly force against that person. And so all I'm saying is that if a group of individuals wants to elect that a certain person could come in, or a certain group of people could come in, especially for those individuals who, you know, a lot of people made this argument on Twitter before that your rights are only as good as what you can defend and protect. Like your property rights really only extend as far as you can protect them. And in some ways that's true. But part of me does believe that it would be kind of a dystopic world where, like, you know, I mean, unfortunately both of my grandmothers have passed. But there was a time when one of my grandmothers lived by herself. And I don't want to live in a world where, you know, it's like, well, she's not allowed to make sure that she lives in a place where there's a group of people who would help protect her property rights, help protect her property of body as in her life, her real estate, you know, from burglary, trespass, whatever. There's some people who really are not capable of doing that. Like, and it's not their fault. And it's not a situation where I'm like, because of certain, you know, characteristics, immutable characteristics, people can't do that. It's more so just that, I mean, personally, I think I'm pretty capable of defending my property because, you know, I train with my firearms and I have them and, you know, I can do that. But not everyone is in that position. And I do think that it's not an evil. Like, if let's go back to the example where maybe I might get sexually assaulted walking around in Denver. If I didn't carry a firearm, right, but some guy saw that I was getting, you know, molested on the street and I couldn't get out of it, and he took out a gun and shot that guy, I think that guy was more than justified to use deadly force against the potential rapist as well. I mean, is he not? Is he not allowed to protect someone else who's vulnerable? So all I'm saying is that, yes, force is bad, generally, right? And even in that instance, he still committed an act of violence against someone else. It's not as if he didn't commit a homicide. It's just that it was justifiable because he was stopping an act of violence against me, right? When I, in that situation, couldn't defend myself. So that's what a government should do. A government should be the guy who shoots the rapist when I can't get him off of me. That's what a government should be, right? And it's the same thing with stuff like fraud. We can all agree that fraud, not necessarily that it's like aggression, but it certainly is an act of deceit, right? And I think many like anarchists too would agree that fraud is something that would be a violation, you know, of like the rights of the other person, right? It's like, or Edgar, will you agree that fraud's not a good thing in Ancapistan? Yeah. Okay. So so similarly, this is where I get into stuff like courts, and I want to address some arguments that I get a lot about this. I want to agree that we could privatize the actual court proceedings, right? The part that is adjudicating who was in the wrong, right? The whole King Solomon, I'll split the baby because that way I'll figure out who really cares about it. Like that whole process, yeah, that can be private and arbitration. Arbitration's really hot. It's hot in the legal field too. People love writing those arbitration clauses in contracts. They think they're so like spicy and fun. And sometimes they really are great, like especially for technology. Like if you have a case, like maybe you're an engineer, like an aerospace engineer, and you're in some kind of patent lawsuit between, you know, engineer companies, something like that. Maybe it would be better to have a judge or an arbitrator that actually understands all of that science instead of a lay jury, especially if that's what the two parties want. And I think that's totally fine. And that's always what people say to me when I say that there's a problem of enforcement. And that's where the government comes in, okay? So the issue with enforcement is that it kind of requires force. Like if you're going to enforce property rights, like there has to be a consequence for the violation of that. And if there is a consequence for the violation of that, we want to make sure that the consequences are not unjust for the crime committed, right? Like this is part of the reason why back in the day they reined in judges with their sentencing stuff, although that ended up causing other problems because they wrote in mandatory sentences and that was a whole mess, right? But before they had any sentencing guidelines, judges in the South, you know, they would give a white guy probation and they'd like sentence a black guy to like life in prison for the same offense. And so a lot of people will say like, oh, we could just have these competing insurance companies. And I'll be like, well, but who sets the standard for what the penalty is though? Like who sets the standard for what the penalty is for trying to rape somebody? Or should there, like, personally I think that there should be an understanding and expectation of what kind of penalty or punishment you'll receive if you commit a crime. It's one of the fundamentals of our rule of law is that you know and understand that what the kind of consequences are for your actions, you know? And even if maybe you're not fully read up on the whole thing, and I'm sure that I'll get people who are like, ignorance of the law is no excuse, blah, blah, blah. But in general, if you murder someone, you kind of know that that's going to be a pretty rough penalty, right? Whereas if you just shoplift something, like if you stole like $10 worth of merchandise, I mean, really, should you be in prison for that? Probably not, you know? So there has to be some consistency across punishment. It's part of the rule of law. It's part of kind of due process too. Part of making sure that one person who, if you committed the same crime as someone else in the same country, that you get the same punishment, right? Or at least in the same jurisdiction. The whole countries thing, I mean, countries, states, counties, whatever. But there should be an expectation and understanding of what kind of penalty you're going to get for a crime that you commit. So that's part of my problem with that. Who sets the stand without a government? Who sets the standard for what the penalty should be? Now, I want to make clear that, and this is a Thomas Jefferson adage, right? But the authority of the government has to come from the consent of the governed. Always. And that's why I use an example of a neighborhood where those people come together and choose to create that government. It was their elective choice, right? So I just want to make that clear. It's not a situation where some dude can just come in, roll into a neighborhood and be like, hey, I'm the government of this here territory now, y'all. And I'm the one who gets to decide the law. It's like, no. The law is actually decided by the people. And then they have an entity that can enforce that. And the reason why they have the monopoly on the use of force is because you don't want anyone else committing acts of violence, right? And quite frankly, the only thing the government is good at is force. So let's put them to use where force is actually appropriate, which is in the defense of property rights. Okay? So, because it's true. It's all the government can do is use force. And this gets me back to the whole idea about the arbitration, right? So binding arbitration, that gets thrown at me all the time. I love it. I love arbitration. It's good stuff. Binding arbitration, perfect. What happens when someone gets an order against them in a binding arbitration and they refuse to comply with it? What happens? I've never had an anarchist answer this, other than going into the insurance company situation. Perhaps Edgar has an answer.
Repeat it.
Okay.
Just so I understand it.
Edgar wants to make sure he understands the question fully. So, you go to a binding arbitration, right? Which is good. I like those. I'm in favor of those. You get a judgment against someone because they breached a contract, right? The arbitrator says they owe you $100K. Here's a judgment in your favor. And that person's like, I'm not going to pay it. What do?
There's really not much you can do, honestly.
Right, because there's no enforcement mechanism.
Well, even now, I mean, O.J. Simpson still owes millions of dollars.
Yeah, I mean, the whole judgment in terms of monetary stuff is hard. Although, smaller OJ, of course, can get away with it. Smaller people, they'll just garnish your wages and, take everything from you. But that's kind of the issue, right? It's true. It's like, how do you get someone to comply with something like that unless they want to? And people will be like, oh, well, I got an arbitration judgment and they complied. It's like, well, good for you. I'm glad that you had an opposing party that didn't try to cheat you and that they were honest. But I gotta tell you, I worked for the courts, okay? The amount of times that an arbitration judgment ended up on my desk because one of the parties refused to comply with the judgment was all the frickin' time. People will not pay like $100,000 to someone else unless they kind of have to. People don't want to admit that they're wrong. People don't want to say that they committed fraud, And similarly, like, okay, so let's say you have these situations where it's like, okay, someone tried to commit a rape. We have an insurance company that says that, a rapist gets penalized with X amount of years of time. It's like, what if he doesn't show up to, who are the jails private, I guess? That's, it's like, are they incentivized to make profits? Or are there no jails? And if that's the case, is the penalty for something like rape just monetary? I don't know. See, these are all things. It's like, I think that if someone is a serial rapist or just any kind of rapist, they should be removed from society. That's someone who force should be used against. Same thing with murderers and burglars and robbers and fraudsters and, and it's the same thing with even with our politicians who commit war crimes and stuff. It's like, these people should be in prison. They are dangerous to other people. They've committed acts of violence against other people. And I go into all of that, and I know that I haven't really talked about property specifically yet, but I had to kind of preface it with that so that you can understand the next things I'm going to talk about. So, if you're going to have a mechanism to defend your real property, which is your land, your personal property, like my purse, my wallet, right? I'm a little old lady walking down the street. Some guy steals my purse. Oh, he stole my purse. Like, you know, she might be lucky and have like a great like bystander nearby who's a concealed carry person who helps her out and like gets that purse back. But I think that it's perfectly reasonable to have an entity that can actually do a bit of force where force would be appropriate on behalf of that individual's property. I think that it's abundantly clear in the case of property of body that you should be able to do that as well. Like I've used the example of rapists and murderers a lot. Those are the ultimate violations of your property of body, right? Your property of mind, I mean, the government's way to protect this is just basically to not freaking spy on us. And, you know, the property of mind stuff, a lot of it is in the Bill of Rights, you know. Your right to free speech, your right to religion, all of that. It's like the government should not be able to make laws. Like even your legislature, even those representatives of you who can write law, they still shouldn't be able to write any laws that basically would make the government invalid, right? And that's why in Marbury v. Madison, even though that case has other problems, but in Marbury v. Madison, the justice who wrote that case said that any law that is repugnant to the Constitution is no law at all. But it's not just because that judge declared it so, but it's because what the Constitution set out to do, I mean, it's failed because it's been interpreted and perverted and spun forever, just into oblivion, and to where it's actually created a bigger government, right? But what the Constitution intended to do was to create a government that, you know, had limited powers, and then these certain rights can't be infringed. But those certain rights that couldn't be infringed, really, those are property rights. Like they weren't able to really articulate it all the way, but they were trying to say, we're creating a government that protects property rights, and that's the purpose of it, right? Like even in the powers of the Constitution, the things that they give the federal government authority to do, it's like, even the clauses that I kind of hate that have been perverted a lot, like the Interstate Commerce Clause, if you think about why that was probably written, it's like, we want the free exchange of trade, right, which is your right to convey your personal property, right? So we want that process across states to be as easy as possible, and so we want the government to be able to facilitate that. And that's even for a clause in the Constitution that I really think has been abused. But the point is that our founders tried to create a government that was the freest government in the history of the world. And they did do that. But they failed to completely articulate, in my opinion, specifically what the role of the government is. Like Thomas Jefferson did a great job in the Declaration of Independence, you know. The government, you know, their authority comes from the consent of the governed. You know, we have these inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you know. But the government, the only thing the government can legitimately do is use force in a way that is also legitimate where an individual would do it. Because like I said with Bastiat, if an individual can't do it, then why on earth should the government be able to? But we have gotten so far past that, right? I mean, our governor has written an executive order saying that you can't go more than 10 miles from your house for anything other than essential activities. Now, this violates a lot of property rights. I mean, it basically is telling me that even though I have a car, there's a limitation on how far I can drive it. Even within my own state, even within a state where they've robbed me for the sake of the roads that they're prohibiting me to drive on past a certain distance, right? let's think about some of the other executive orders that have been happening, at least in Colorado. And this is all over the place, I guess, too. But you can't dine in a fine dining restaurant anymore. So basically what you're saying is if you are a restaurateur and you own land, you no longer have the right to decide who comes to your property and when. Right, like your ability to control your property, your right to control, your right to exclude from, your right to enjoy, all of that is completely limited. You can't use your real estate that's a restaurant for serving food to individuals at a table anymore. So that also violates your rights in terms of your personal property. You can't sell food to people who want to purchase it from you. You can't use the tables and chairs within your own restaurant to have diners sit there. So all that's a huge violation. Your property of body, the biggest property of body violation we have is this damn forced masks situation. I mean, if you want to wear a mask, fine. Especially if you're immunocompromised or something, you really should be. But it is a violation of my property of body to order me to wear a mask. You can't force me to put something on my face. It's the same problem I have with burqas and all this other crap in Sharia law countries. It's like, don't order a woman that she has to cover her hair for her own safety. That's insane. And we shouldn't do it here either. And then the whole property of mind thing. Think about how much our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our right to protest, our right to assemble have just been annihilated. So we basically have a government right now that is doing the exact opposite of its purpose, man. Like, our government is violating all of the rights that they're supposed to be protecting. And it's really a tragic situation. And that's why I think that it's always better to get it closer and closer to the individual. Because in that example I had with like the neighborhood watch cop guy, if that guy or his like crew of maybe 3 guys really started to get out of hand, they could overpower that guy and throw him out and, do whatever they needed. But what are you supposed to do? Like, I watched Waco, right? Because I didn't hate the government enough. So I decided to watch Waco because that was a smart choice. And in that situation, there was a line in there where it's like, what do you do when your government is the one who's driving a tank into your, like, ranch home? It's like, it's a good point. This government is too big. This government is so far detached from the individuals that they're supposed to serve. So personally, like, my ideal government would be way smaller. It would be like more like at the county level where if someone messed something up, you could throw that motherfucker out of office like that, and it would be easy. But instead, they keep trying to push government further away, right? They're trying to do that now. It's like, we're listening to stuff from the World Health Organization, from the UN. It's like those people are more out of touch with what's happening with average people all around the world than almost anybody. Those people are in such huge ivory towers. And it's the same thing with our federal government right now. People are totally fine with Trump acting like a king, and they were fine with Obama acting like a king too. They're fine with Congress lying to them all the time. They're fine with Congress abdicating their authority regarding war and regarding all of this stuff to the president, Like, they've all just been derelict in their duties, and we've done nothing about it. But the truth is, just like the neighborhood, where the people in those neighborhoods should be able to throw out whatever little cop they hired, we, the states, should be able to throw out our government. And I think that in terms of the consent of the governed, I do think that should be able to be withdrawn to a certain extent. So, Coloradans, right? It's like we've given our governor a certain amount of consent to govern Colorado. But all those people up in Boulder Creek, those people are not consenting to his governance anymore. They're not consenting to the governance of whatever mayor ordered them that they're not allowed to go be outside at a river without a mask on, you know? And I actually think that that's what's going to happen ultimately with these lockdowns, is that people are just going to stop caring, man. And the truth is, once you lose the faith of the people, you can't enforce almost anything anymore. You know? So governments who really overstep their authority like this, especially the way that our governors and mayors are just drunk with power, these governments are not legitimate. They're not serving their purpose. They're not using force in a way that's appropriate. And I agree that the only thing the government can do is force. So they should be like, let's put them to the task to use force where force is appropriate. Because they're really good at that. It's all they're good at. Like, again, with Waco. They're not good at negotiating. They're not good at understanding how to talk to people. But what they're really good with is, like, you know, blasting a building with tear gas and blowing that crap up. You know, it's like, so in terms of if a government, like, in terms of, is a government good at punishing a rapist? Like, yeah, they're pretty good at punishing people. That's pretty much all they can do. So what we as a people, though, need to do is to be vigilant in making sure that our governments actually stay to this charge. This is one of the things that's been so sad in America. People are totally fine with the powers that the government's taking. Like I begged for in the beginning of this podcast, people have no skepticism regarding their leaders, even though they know they've been lied to over and over and over again. So, you know, if you're trying to have a small government, you have to have people who are going to be vigilant in keeping it that way, which is why I am vigilant about it. I try to be. I try to do as much as I can to shrink government to the extent that I can. I talk about this stuff. I try to help people understand the crimes that the government commits against its people. Because governments commit crimes against their people, just like people commit crimes against other people. And when government officials do that, they should be brought to justice and put in jail, just like any other person who committed a crime, or any other person who used force in a way that was not justified or excusable. So, anyway, that is the property rights exploration of the role of government. And trust me when I say that I really don't like defending the government at all, okay? Like, this is the only time I'm gonna do that. But it had to be done once. But now it's over with. I could go back to talking about how the government has been fucking everything up, which they have been.